In the early 1800s, being sold down the river was a virtual death sentence. In The Tragedy of Pudd'nhead Wilson, Mark Twain uses the expression "sold down the river" to describe the ultimate act of betrayal. The expression originated in the early 1800s and describes the act of transporting slaves from the Upper South, such as Virginia, Maryland, and Kentucky, to the Deep South, such as Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, to work on cotton plantations. Compared to working on tobacco plantations in the Upper South, working on cotton plantations in the Deep South was tortuous and deadly. The mortality rate for slaves in the Deep South was very high due to diseases like malaria, the hot climate, the hard labor, and the brutality. The high mortality rate fueled the ever-increasing demand for slaves in the Deep South. Slaves who worked on large cotton plantations from dawn to dusk were severely whipped if they failed to meet their daily and ever-increasing production quotas. Profiting in the risky and competitive business of cotton production meant extracting as much labor from enslaved people as possible, even to their detriment. The average field laborer only lived to their early 20s. The word river in the expression "sold down the river" refers to transporting slaves down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers on river boats to locations in the Deep South, such as New Orleans and Natchez. Many slaves realized that being sold down the river was a virtual death sentence. There are accounts of slaves committing suicide. Being sold down the river literally meant being placed on a river boat in Kentucky and being sent to slave markets along the Mississippi River, such as New Orleans or Natchez, to be sold. Kentucky was a slave breeding state that exported thousands of slaves annually to cotton plantations in the Deep South. Ironically, Kentucky was also a border state. A runaway slave could leave Kentucky and escape bondage by crossing the Ohio River and entering the free states of Ohio or Indiana. Several notable fugitives crossed the Ohio River from Kentucky to escape bondage. Two of these notable fugitives were Henry Bibb, who told his life story in his narrative of the life and adventures of Henry Bibb, and Margaret Garner, the inspiration for the novel beloved by Nobel Prize-winning author Toni Morrison. In 1850, Henry Bibb crossed the Ohio River and escaped to freedom in Canada. By traveling to Canada, Henry Bibb avoided being recaptured by slave catchers. Unlike free states, Canada did not recognize the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Margaret Garner escaped with her family from Kentucky to freedom in Ohio in 1856. However, the U.S. Marshals apprehended the family under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Rather than return to slavery, Margaret Garner attempted to kill her family and herself with a knife. But only her 2-year-old daughter died. During the winter, the surface of the Ohio River would freeze solid, and it was possible for slaves to literally walk across the frozen river to freedom. Many slaves referred to the Ohio River as the River of Jordan. According to the Bible, the Israelites crossed the Jordan River to reach the Promised Land. Tens of thousands of slaves escaped bondage by crossing the Ohio River by way of Kentucky. The Underground Railroad operated primarily in the free states as opposed to slave-holding states. Runaway slaves were for the most part on their own until they crossed either the Ohio River or the Mason-Dixon line and entered a free state. Nonetheless, federal laws such as the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 meant that runaway slaves could still be recaptured in free states and sent back to slave-holding states. Under the law, the federal government was responsible for capturing runaway slaves and returning them to their owners. As a result, the ultimate goal of many runaway slaves was to reach Canada, which did not recognize the Fugitive Slave Act. Most of the slaves who successfully escaped to freedom in a free state or Canada did so from a border state such as Kentucky, Virginia, or Maryland. From Kentucky, an enslaved person would merely have to cross the Ohio River and enter a free state, such as Indiana or Ohio, before proceeding to Canada. From Virginia or Maryland, an enslaved person would have to cross the Mason-Dixon line and enter the free state of Pennsylvania, before proceeding to Canada. On the other hand, for an enslaved person to escape to freedom from the Deep South was almost an impossible task. The Underground Railroad was not actually a railroad, but a network of safe houses that assisted runaway slaves in traveling northward from southern slave-holding states to northern free states in Canada. Safe houses were homes, churches, schoolhouses, and businesses that temporarily sheltered runaway slaves along the Underground Railroad. Safe houses provided runaway slaves with shelter, food, and rest while hiding from slave catchers. The owners of these safe houses were ordinary people who were called station managers. Station managers were generally whites who were sympathetic to the abolitionist movement and willing to take the risk of breaking the law. Most safe houses were approximately 20 miles apart. This allowed runaway slaves to travel from one safe house to the next at night under cover of darkness. To avoid capture by slave catchers, the paths along the Underground Railroad were improvised and in constant flux. Runaway slaves generally traveled along footpaths, roads, tunnels, caves, mountain trails, and waterways. Individuals known as vigilance agents procured money, food, clothes, travel documents, and supplies for runaway slaves. The Underground Railroad was predominantly operated by free Northern African Americans, such as Philadelphian William Still, with the assistance of abolitionists and Quakers. Runaway slaves were called passengers. Runaway slaves were generally young men, in their teens and 20s, who left their plantation alone at night. This was known as self-emancipation. They received no assistance until they crossed the Ohio River or the Mason-Dixon line. Relatively few women left their plantations due to family and child-rearing responsibilities. Those who guided runaway slaves along the route were called conductors. The most famous conductor was Harriet Tubman, who led several groups of runaway slaves from Maryland plantations across the Mason-Dixon line to freedom in Pennsylvania. Slave catchers were usually in hot pursuit of runaway slaves. Slave catchers hid out at known locations along the Underground Railroad in the hope of catching runaway slaves. Federal law, such as the Fugitive Slave Act, made slave catching a lucrative business that could be conducted in both slave-holding states and free states. Slave catchers also captured free black people and sold them into slavery in the Deep South. 12 Years a Slave is a 1853 memoir and slave narrative by Solomon Northup. Solomon Northup was born free in New York State. He was kidnapped by slave catchers in Washington, D.C., and sold into slavery in Louisiana. Northup was held captive for 12 years. Slave catchers frequently kidnapped free black people in and around the border states, such as Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. But kidnapping also occurred in New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois, and Tennessee. Since slave catchers could profit either way, it made no difference to them whether they were capturing a fugitive slave or kidnapping a free black person. Some slave catchers lured free black people into places and situations where they could be kidnapped, for instance, promising a job or some other opportunity. Solomon Northup was lured from New York State to Washington, D.C., by slave catchers with the offer of financial opportunity. Once kidnapped, it was almost impossible for a free black person to regain their freedom. Kidnappers destroyed freedom papers. In New York City, slave catchers and members of the New York City Police Department worked hand in hand to kidnap free black people. The collaboration was known as the Kidnapping Club. New York State abolished slavery within its borders in 1827. Nonetheless, being kidnapped by slave catchers was a major concern for both fugitive slaves and free black people. Black sailors were kidnapped at harbors. Children were being kidnapped on their way home from school. Black servants who traveled into slave-holding states with their employer were being kidnapped. Black people who were held in New York City municipal jails were being sold into slavery by corrupt police officers. The New York City courts were indifferent to protecting the rights of free black people who were kidnapped by slave catchers. The New York City courts routinely allowed free black people to be sold into slavery, and a successful intervention from a court was rare. A free black person's friends and family could not testify in court on their behalf since black people were not allowed to testify in court against white people. It was difficult to find white people who would testify on a black person's behalf. If the free black person produced freedom papers, a court might rule that the papers were forged. The possibility of being kidnapped and sold into slavery was a major concern of free black people in both the slave-holding and free states. A free black person could reside in a free state like Pennsylvania, Ohio, or Indiana. Slave catchers could enter the state and kidnap a black person by means of home invasion. No warrants were required. The person would then be taken across state lines to a slave-holding state, such as Maryland or Kentucky, before being sold into slavery in the Deep South.